So just like to welcome everybody to this second webinar of the online knowledge sharing platform to look at how can local finance be used for forest and landscape restoration, using case studies to share lessons from the field of how this is implemented in action. This community of practice for finance for forest and landscape restoration is a co-organised between the Forest and Landscape Restoration Mechanism of the Food and Agriculture Organisation of the United Nations, together with the WWF's Landscape Finance Lab, so with myself, Lucy Garrett, and Disha Chandra. The objectives of this forum is to share experience and lessons learnt on the implementation of financing mechanisms to support FLR, with a focus on how, in particular, this finance will support smallholders to implement activities, how they were coordinated on the ground, and how they were integrated within different financial mechanisms, and the challenges faced in seeking, coordinating and enabling the sustainability of finance within the landscape. Briefly, before we get into discussions, to try and understand the context of why this topic. So this webinar is building on a previous earlier webinar on looking at local finance mechanisms, a review of different types of finance mechanisms for restoration and FLR. So the key messages that came from this was that these mechanisms to support local implementation in particular were highly contextually dependent. One size will not fit all, which is why the idea of using case studies to understand how different mechanisms and different types of finance can be used to support different activities on the ground was needed. And also how alignment with other investments in the landscape can help realise ecosystem-wide benefits, to the idea to scale up across the landscape. And again, how these restoration activities can also contribute to multiple elements of the landscape that are not just looking at financial returns, but are looking at much wider ecosystem services, benefits and sustainability as well. And also as well, how we need to take into account not just the spatial interactions, but also off-site impacts in the landscape, and how these financial decisions and investment designs need to be implemented within that context. They can't be implemented within a vacuum. So I think I'll hand over to Disha to give a brief overview of the objectives of the webinar and some of the polls that we will be conducting during the presentations. Disha.
Brilliant, thank you. And so thanks everyone for joining the session. So the case studies will look at a few questions around the finance that was needed to get the program off the ground, or even the finance being sought, and also what types of finance were used for different activities on the ground, and in some cases where it's the intention to use these for certain activities, and how finance was coordinated within the landscape, and how they are reaching actors on the ground as well. One of the things that we would like to share just before we start is a very quick poll, very closely linked to the survey that we've sent out via the LinkedIn group and also the D groups, where we're sharing further communication about these webinars and sharing additional resources. If I can just launch this short poll, and if you can take a couple of minutes just to quickly complete it, and we'll share a link for a further survey in the chat feed as well. So that poll is live now. If I can give everybody maybe a minute to complete it, it's all very quick. Do let me know if you don't see this on your screens. And I guess one of the things to mention about this poll is that these answers guide how we will set content going forward over the next year, especially useful around the languages, accessibility, and the various platforms that are easy for you to access and engage with as well.
So further to the polls that we'll be conducting, this is just a link to a online survey which will have a few more questions in detail to get a training needs assessment for how this community of practice training on finance can better meet the needs of participants. The link will be sent out to participants who have registered at the end of the webinar. But these are just some of the results that have come up so far. That there is a keen interest in getting to know a bit more about how blended finance, public partner, private sector engagement can be used to finance activities, as well as the different types, the different products and activities that would be used, for example, webinars, exchange on local and regional issues, or e-learning courses. And I think this feeds quite well into the upcoming case studies that we will share. And Disha, I don't know if should we give the results of the poll towards the end of the webinar?
Sure, I'll have it saved at the bottom, yeah.
So we have three speakers with us today to share key lessons learned from their implementation of financing local activities for restoration and forest and landscape restoration on the ground. So the first presenter, Raphaele Deau, is a market lead with the Landscape Finance Lab, and she will be sharing how the collaborational framework of the GCLP, a landscape program aimed to conserve forests through sustainable cocoa production in Cameroon. We also have with us today Pauline Nantongo Kalunda, the Executive Director of ECOTRUST Uganda, who will be speaking about the Trees for Global Benefits, which is one of the most successful community-based carbon trading schemes running at the moment in Uganda, with more than 2,500 households receiving payments. There's been a slight change to the schedule, and we have Enock Kiminta today with us from Imarisha, Naivasha, Kenya, who will present an overview of how diverse sources of finance are coordinated within the Lake Naivasha Basin through the Community Water Resource Users Forum to address diverse needs and diverse stakeholders. So we're going to start with Raphaele's presentation. Raphaele will share her strategic and technical support on sustainable sourcing with the lab. She's an expert on sustainable value chains and green growth development with extensive experience in the Mekong region and a strong track record bringing together private companies, NGOs and government agencies to collaborate on low carbon development. And at WWF, she's acted as a coordinator of the Impact in the Forests report, which sets recommendations to accelerate deforestation-free business. So I will leave the floor to you, Raphaele.
Thanks, Lucy. Hello, everyone. So my name is Raphaele. I'm the market lead of the Landscape Finance Lab, meaning that I work particularly with companies in a landscape approach. So I'll be sharing with you some elements of this Green Cocoa Landscape program in Cameroon, knowing that the main thematic is on lessons learned on finance. We're not there yet, so I just want to manage expectations. I'll be sharing with you the start of the design and where we're up today, but happy to answer any questions in the Q&A on more of the financials that we'll be looking for in the future. So next, Lucy, please. Before I jump into Cameroon case study, I'd like to just refresh for those who know us or those who don't know us what the lab is doing. So the Landscape Finance Lab is a WWF program which acts as a platform to incubate and support high quality landscape investment program. So we're looking at quite large investment opportunities and we work in both vertical and horizontal approaches through the value chain of the companies, identifying bankable projects, or horizontally with existing conservation projects or green development plans in collaboration with governments. Next, please. What we use for this is an international recognized process, and the reason why I'm stopping on this is because there's a lot of different landscape approach pilots and examples, out there in the world. Not all of them using the same system or the same definitions, but I just wanted to refresh your mind that about 80 competing terms back in 2015 came to just one single definition, and that was captured in the Little Sustainable Landscape book that you see at the bottom line, and signed off by a number of NGOs that you see as well at the bottom right. So what we're using at the lab really is this process and those definitions, and trying to implement them throughout all the landscape portfolio that we help coordinating. And for this, we use 5 steps, as you can see in that green box. So really the reason for the lab is also to standardize and build up processes that can be replicated faster and just accelerate impacts and results at scale. Next, please. So when it comes to the... Oh, it doesn't show next, Lucy? Yeah, thank you. So you can click on next as well. When it comes to the Green Cocoa Landscape Program in Cameroon, the reason why we got interested in this originally is because we were invited by WWF Switzerland and Barry Callebaut, which is one of the main cocoa trader and chocolate producer in the world, to do a scoping study. Cameroon came really on top of the list of priorities because it presented quite a strong enabling framework. In summary, really, we want to avoid in Cameroon what has happened in Ghana and Ivory Coast in the last 10 to 15 years, and those for 2 reasons. And you'll understand through those graphs here on that slide. The industry really does care about cocoa today because climate change is putting so much pressure on the production locations that it might just reshuffle the cards in the next 5 years. And the industry altogether is under threat because of these pressure. Second topic is that NGOs, and you've got the example here of the Mighty Earth latest publication, are putting increasing pressure themselves on the industry altogether to act more responsibly on social and environmental impacts. We know that more publications are on the way, under developments. We've been contacted for that reason. And so, there's really a momentum in Cameroon to build something that is longing and sustainable, with all actors who've been learning a lot of lessons in other countries that could be replicated in Cameroon. So next slide, please. The rationale behind that program in Cameroon is that we're aware that the Cameroon is not #1 production country, but there's a very high level expectations from the government to double the volumes, and officially that was by next year. Obviously, this is not going to happen. We're currently a bit less than 300,000 million tons per year, but they really have the scheme to double that figure in the next few years. So that's going to put pressure on the forests of Cameroon that are currently covering 46%, which is quite high, of the national territory. But we can see the deforestation front moving away and just gaining more and more protected area. And I should say that the issue in Cameroon is not necessarily a deforestation issue, but degradation as well. And so cocoa is participating to that degradation of forests, not necessarily the first being the first threat to deforestation. So there's a need for collaboration towards, a more sustainable cocoa sector that would contribute to farmers' livelihoods and forest protection. Next slide. It's a long process. It's going to take quite a few years. We're just at the beginning of it. We started about 10 months ago, last September, in collaboration with IDH and a number of companies who've been, the most active in the discussion so far. This is not an exclusive list, I shall say. There's a few other actors from the Netherlands and France as well. But basically, the milestones were earlier this year with the scoping study findings, a couple of workshops that gathered about 50 to 60 participants, all cocoa traders and sources in the country, cocoa actors, cooperative of farmers, And the scoping study really looked at how that program could be embedded in the long run. And for that reason, we all together commonly agreed that we should leverage this program and embed it into the municipalities that currently own the land use plan in the country of Cameroon. So we selected 3 municipalities as pilots back in February, and we've developed project identification notes for them. Next slide, please. The 3 pilots, or landscapes, or clusters as we call them, have been extracted from a list of 5. That's the Grand Bam, that presents the particularity of having a low forest cover, although there's a few protected area managed by WCS. But it's, lately we've seen that cocoa through an agroforestry systems have managed to increase the forest cover and restore the land and forest. So here cocoa in Grand Bam is being used to reforest more actively than what was expected. The second selected cluster is the region of Ayos, that has seen previous cocoa programs, RED Plus trials with SNV, GIZ, through the ProCisa and Eco and Cocoa Plus, Cocoa Eco Plus, programs, if you're familiar with Cameroon. So we want to learn from the lessons and replicate the success of those trials elsewhere. And finally, the third one is the Tridom area, where WWF is the most active. Tridom because it's actually a transboundary landscape with Gabon and Congo neighboring countries. The forest cover out there is more than 90% actually, but it's very strongly impacted by infrastructure development and a road that is getting deeper and deeper into the forest. So opening up to all sorts of economic activities and future developments. Next, please. If you look at those 3 landscapes altogether, they account for about 30% of the cocoa production, which is, substantial, but not obviously the majority. For those of you who know Cameroon, you would know that the southwest, so the other dark red on the left region, is the #1 production country, but is currently restricted in its access because of social conflicts that are occurring there. So it's been that way for the last year or so. And so obviously those conflicts are pushing the production line and the sourcing line to other states, and with this just increasing volume sourcing in other areas. So those 3 clusters are accounting for 30%, as I said, with the Grand Bam being the main let's say the second largest producing region. Next, please. And so with those 3 clusters, we want to build lessons learned and translate those lessons from one cluster to another through different approaches and complementary approaches from IDH and WWF collaboration. So this is the first time that, the 2 organizations will be, actively collaborating with one another on a landscape level. And so you'll recognize a few success factors and elements here. On top of that graph, you'll see the 3 what we call catalysts. It's essential to have a very strong governance system through all the few elements and bullet points you can see here. I'll come back to some of them later in the presentation. It's equally essential to have access to markets with purchase agreements or advanced purchase agreement. This is the role of the cocoa buyers. And finally, another catalyzer is sourcing of finance. So we are in discussion with a few local financial institutions and international funding mechanisms as well. In the lower half of that graph, you recognize the PPI approach of the IDH. To cover sustainable production, protection and restoration, and inclusion. So we've got, those 3 pillars with a set of interventions in each specific clusters. And then on the right, you recognize the 5 elements of the landscape approach that WWF has signed off, starting with a multi-stakeholder platform, a shared understanding, collaborative planning, and so on, really setting a process for discussion throughout the program development. Next, please. Or you can skip this one, and I'll go straight to the success factors. As I said earlier, there's a few success factors that would be particularly essential on this program. Also, as we look at a national scheme that may be quite complex, because there will be hopefully strong ownership at the local level, but also at the national level. So the governance at the landscape level would be key. That means going through clear roles and responsibilities for all stakeholders, not only the government actors, but also the private sectors, cocoa cooperatives, financial institutions as well. And that will go obviously through a green growth plan that currently is in the hands of the municipalities, as I said earlier. So we hope to have this shared understanding and collaborative planning signed off in a green growth plan. Compacts or memorandum of understanding between all actors will be essential as well, clarifying, as I said, roles and responsibilities, but how this will evolve through implementation. And finally, a credible monitoring and assurance system at the landscape level. So really, making sure the government's system is being audited, screened and reassessed at different milestones. On the cocoa activities themselves, again, a lot of performance indicators will be put in place and credible assurance and monitoring systems that will go through traceable systems that are currently missing, because there's a few traceability systems being tested and piloted with each company. They're not using the same baseline, and obviously they're acting in different locations, but we're looking at the national traceability systems, similar to what has been done in Ghana and Ivory Coast, that all companies and all actors could use in a transparent way. And again, that could go through a definition that could be used commonly in the country on what we mean by debt-free sustainable cocoa, and currently that's missing. So a big work ahead of us, but there's a few elements and tools we can use, such as the Accountability Framework Initiative, for those who know it. This is for cocoa, but obviously, as we develop that program, other sectors will be involved and reached out. We have not yet started that work. That will come in a second stage. I think for you to understand is good that we will be using cocoa as a leverage to engage other sectors that might be a bit more problematic or less ready to engage in the landscape approach. We chose cocoa for opportunistic reason. I think there was a ripe momentum and also a lot of lessons learned from other countries that we can learn. As an industry as well, cocoa gathers a lot of actors and through the World Cocoa Foundation or other platforms. And so, that's for Cameroon, although not the main threat to deforestation and forest degradation, a sector that is important enough to then engage further with other sectors. And finally, at all levels, we'll have to find very clear incentives. And when I mean incentive, I mean financial incentives. So we've been looking at a premium price or a fair price or a minimum price that we could set for farmers to be incentivized to protect forest, and better marketing tools, how to brand cocoa made out of Cameroon or debt-free cocoa from Cameroon in a better way than is currently done. Next slide, please. So when it comes to financing, as I said at the beginning, we're not, fully developed yet, and we're just at the beginning. So, but this is the theory that the lab is using. Basically, if we start with, $500,000 or so of grants in a co-funding. And I apologize for the logos because I see they're really narrowed and shrunk here. So just a layout issue, obviously, but apologize if there are any representative from some of the logos on the screen. Anyway, coming back to the theory of change, we believe that with initial grant funding in a co-funding mechanisms, we can trigger a few funds that are being the most active in the region, to leverage then a much higher pot of money in public investments, so in the area of tens of millions of dollars, then that would leverage or trigger themselves, further private sector investment and impact investing. So you see a few logos here. We are in discussion with all of them. They're not yet partners or collaborators. This is just an examples for you to explain or understand, how we plan to cover the funding of this entire program. It's a long term, 5 years before we can get a full proposal to a fund. We're just at the beginning, and currently we've got a design for each landscapes, but we need to raise funds for, for those designs to be put in a prototype and then in a pilot phase, and then onwards. So I hope I was not too long. I'll just stop here. I think there's a next slide. Let's see. Or maybe I'm done. Yes. So I'll pause here, but happy to answer further questions in the Q&A session. Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you very much, Raphaele. It's a very interesting example of how a restoration project is being designed and developed along using a value chain approach, and how the use of cocoa, the cocoa value chain, to leverage and encourage other sectors to engage in a similar approach. I'd be interested to see, using your long-term financing planning, how and which other sectors will engage. And I think that's quite applicable in many other case studies. I'd just like to open the floor very quickly to see if there are any questions from participants to clarify anything from Raphaele's presentation. And if not, I think we'll move straight into Enock's presentation. So Enock Kiminta is on the board for Lake Naivasha. He has many years of experience working within the Lake Naivasha Basin Water Resource Users Association, which is a forum established under the Water Act in 2016, which recognises local communities as co-managers of water resources management in partnership with water resources authorities and like-minded development partners. He's a monitoring and evaluation expert specifically on conservation projects, and is also a board member of the Imarisha Naivasha as a public-private people partnership entity. And he will present today about how local finance can be used for forest landscape restoration on the ground. So Enock, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Hi everyone, my name is Enock Kiminta from Kenya. I work for Imarisha Naivasha, which works in Lake Naivasha Basin. This is a government agency established in 2011, specifically to manage the water resources in Lake Naivasha Basin and to restore the Lake Naivasha Basin back to its original functionality. Next slide. Lake Naivasha Basin is at the south floor of the Rift Valley of Kenya. It is a fresh water lake, and the basin itself covers an area of about 3,500 square kilometers. It is divided into three catchments. There is the upper catchment, which is the Aberdares, the forest area. We have the middle catchment, which is mainly savanna land. And we have the lower catchment, which is the lake. The lake depends on two catchments. One is the Aberdares, and the other source is the eastern part of the Mau forest. Next. Now, where are we coming from? If you can just click the next slide. The basin has been and is continuing to experience challenges, and these challenges are threatening the sustainability of the wider environment, the investments depending on the environment, and of course, the livelihoods for communities. And just to run through a few of these challenges as projected is, one is the population expansion, whereby we've been experiencing an increase of population in the basin. And this has really had an impact on the natural resources in the basin. And this has contributed to high over-abstraction of water. We have lost almost 70% of forest area, which has resulted to catchment degradation. We have experienced instances of encroachment of critical habitats in the basin. decline in water quality and quantity. And this, of course, has resulted to production in agricultural produce, especially for the small holders or small producers. The other problem that we have been having is the issue of uncoordinated stakeholder, whereby there has been a lack of common vision in terms of the players in the basin, and this really have brought about reverse negative impacts as far as the landscape is concerned. The other challenge is the challenge of unplanned development. You realize that Lake Naivasha Basin is well known as an economic hub for flower production, tourism, and this has attracted a lot of an influx of immigrants from Kenya trying to come and seek job vacancies or employments in some of these sectors. So this has resulted to mushrooming of unplanned settlements, which really are having a negative impact to the ecosystem. The other challenge is the challenge of inadequate enforcement. In Kenya, we have very good laws and policies on land management, but we still have a problem in terms of enforcing some of those laws. And of course, the issue of climate change has not been really, has also been affecting us in terms of access to water, production in agriculture. It has really affected us in the basin. Next slide. This picture just depicts the multi-stakeholder interest around the basin in terms of who wants what in Lake Naivasha Basin. Because if you look at it, we have the fishermen, we have the small-scale farmers, we have the pastoralists, we have the tourism and the hoteliers, we have the government now who are mandated to enforce, or rather to check, to make sure that these resources are well managed and protected. So this has compounded an increase in competition for the water resources. Next. What are some of the interventions we have put in place as stakeholders to make sure that some of those challenges I've mentioned have been addressed? Is that we have established, through the support of the government of Kenya, an organization called Imarisha Naivasha, and this came from support from the Prince of Wales, that is called the International Sustainability Unit. And basically, this was a wake-up call out of the drought we had in 2009 that resulted to drastic decline in lake levels, river levels, and even the groundwater. So this was quite a key lesson to us, and this has triggered the establishment of the Imarisha Naivasha with a mandate to develop and coordinate and implement a development plan to see if we can reverse some of these negative influences that are causing catchment degradation in Lake Naivasha Basin. Out of this, through the help of the Prince of Wales, we have the UK retailers took a leap of faith. I'm saying a leap of faith because this was totally a new child institution in Kenya, but the retailers in the UK took a leap of faith and pumped in some resources, of course, with the support of the government of Kenya, that we used to address and to address some of the challenges we are facing in the basin. Next slide. And out of this retail supermarket, he has also helped us a lot to mobilize resources from other sources. And one of them is, of course, the government of Kenya, which has specifically ensured that in every budget that is presented in the national budget, the conservation of Lake Naivasha has been factored in. We have also had other like-minded development partners like GIZ, who came in to co-finance some of the activities on water stewardship in Lake Naivasha Basin. We have also had some support from the Dutch embassy, whereby we were implementing a program called the Integrated Water Resource Action Plan that also addressing some of the challenges we are experiencing in the basin. And also we developed, through the support of eco-agriculture, we developed a landscape management for Lake Naivasha Basin. And also other supermarkets came in, for example, the Swiss Coop and the River Supermarket. And for your information, these are the supermarkets that are buying flowers being grown in Lake Naivasha Basin. And some of those slides are just examples of the supermarkets we are working with. Next slide. Again, out of this, it has also increased the focus on investment in the basin. And one case in point is the support we are receiving from the World Bank, whereby they are supporting improvement of informal settlement around across the basin, whereby they are dealing on issues of provision of sanitation services, provision of water supply through support to the local water companies in the basin, and also to see how we can also address the issue of pollution through improvement of the sewerage system in the urban areas in Lake Naivasha Basin. We also have had quite a number of other landscapes coming to learn from us, see how we are doing it. The component of the public-private partnership has been really a success for us, and we have had neighboring countries coming to learn from us. Of course, as a roadmap, as an institution, we have developed a framework called Sustainable Development Action Plan, which basically, next slide please, which basically guide us on the status of the basin and what needs to be restored through an integrated approach. And of course, that enhances stakeholders' participation. And that is the document that is the plan on your left. And basically, it addresses 4 key outcomes. One outcome is the issue of riparian zone management, what needs to be done, and marking out this riparian land. Also, the use of land management in the Lake Naivasha Basin, and water resource management and institutions capacity are developed so that they're able to execute their mandate as provided for in the law. And of course, this particular document recognizes Imarisha and as a functioning institution, effectively in coordinating the Lake Naivasha Basin restoration and management. Next slide. Now, how do we engage the communities? We all know that it is very important for communities to be at the center of planning, implementation, and even sometimes execution of some of these conservation projects or activities. So one way we are doing in Naivasha is we are providing trainings to communities and local farmers in terms of best practices in the catchment. We also provide grants to communities, and some of these communities we are using localized institutions. For example, the Water Resource Use Associations, the Community Forest Association, that are tasked with the responsibility of co-managing the water resources and the forest resources. And we are doing this through development of MOUs, that is Memorandum of Understanding, and of course, financing agreements with specific key deliverables. The other engagement is we are connecting the farmers, especially in the upper catchment of the basin, with other resource beneficiaries, e.g. farmers and private sector, through a very unique scheme we have been running in Naivasha for the last 10 years called the Payment for Ecosystem Services. This is basically a linkage between the downstream users and the upstream users, who are the providers of the service, and the downstream users are the beneficiaries of the users, whereby they pay a small fee to the farmers in the upper catchment, just to motivate them to continue doing conservation. And out of that, because we have seen very successful results and very positive impacts in the catchment, we have now moved, we are now thinking beyond monetary terms. These particular farmers are producing very good crops, but they don't have the markets. So we have a very unique program we introduced last year called the Green Horticulture in Lake Naivasha Basin, whereby we are connecting now them to consumers of some of these produce they are growing in their farms. And the target is the hotels around the Lake Naivasha, whereby they go into an agreement with these farmers for supply of some of the horticultural crops, for example, the vegetables, some fruits to the hotels at a given time of the year. And then they agree upon on what is the price, the mode of supply, how it is packaged. And this has really emerged successful because farmers now have guaranteed markets. And we have also addressed the issue of post-harvest damages, because now farmers already know what does the market need in terms of the hotels they are supplying to. The other engagement is on value chain development through nature-based enterprises, whereby we are training them on beekeeping and providing them with the equipment for beekeeping, and also promoting ecotourism in the catchment. The other engagement is on value chain expansion for farm produce, whereby we are linking the small producers to the large growers, whereby they engage them in terms of contracting them to grow the crops they need. Then they sell on their behalf and pay back to the farmers. Next slide, please. In terms of going forward, we have made quite significant strides in terms of stakeholders and partners engagement, communication, information sharing. Therefore, there is need to consolidate some of these gains made so far and share with the other catchments in the country and regionally and internationally. It's also very important to strengthen environmental monitoring to ensure that some of these activities or interventions we are inputting to manage and conserve our catchment is well documented and properly monitoring. And through a program called Citizen Science Monitoring, we are now using communities to collect some of this data in terms of the projects we have initiated. What are the impacts and what are the issues in terms of quality of the water, the forest products, how is it improving the community livelihoods? So that's some of this data, we are using them for decision making, we are using them for planning, and also to make relevant government agencies accountable where we feel the law is not being enforced to the letter. The issue of riparian land is quite a problem. I mentioned the issue of population growing. You find communities encroaching into forest areas, into water resources bodies. And as an institution, we're working with the government of Kenya through the National Land Commission to develop a management plan that specifically deals with riparian land issues in Lake Naivasha Basin. The other way forward is we want to move the smallholder farmers' livelihoods agenda forward in terms of actualizing the agricultural frameworks in the catchment. The other very significant initiative in terms of going forward is to develop a sustainable development fund. This is more of a funding mechanism to help us implement some of the conservation plans we have, like, for example, the Sustainable Development Action Plan and other undertakings in the basin. Next slide. Now, if I can just go deeper into this SDF we have in Naivasha. The SDF is being managed by the institution, that is the Imarisha Naivasha Trust, and its intention is to strengthen the public-private partnership concept in the basin. And this will establish commitments, or rather will help us get commitments from stakeholders and partners who are depending on the resource for their businesses. For example, the power producers, the tourism sector, the horticultural sector, and the local governments. In Kenya, we call them the county governments, so that they are able to pump in some money into the fund, and this fund is used to manage and to conserve the catchment, or rather to restore the catchment. And we are happy also to report that currently the government of Kenya has also taken up this, and we have it now factored in the government, the national government budgets. And this started in the financial year 2016-2017. Next slide. Yeah, thank you very much for listening. And some of those logos are just an expression or a demonstration of the partnerships we have in the Lake Naivasha Basin, whereby we are working together in partnership to address some of the issues, challenges we are facing in the Lake Naivasha Basin. Thank you very much, and I welcome questions and clarifications that may arise. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting presentation. I think it's quite interesting to see the difference between a well-established restoration and financed initiative in Naivasha compared to the early stages of planning and restoration in Cameroon. We do have a question for you from Tim Radin. Specifically about the Naivasha program. So the farmers get fees from PES scheme, Green Horticulture, but what measures are farmers required to do, and who monitors this as a result of their payments?
Now, the kind of measures we have put in place for the farmers to receive these incentives from the buyers, or rather from the beneficiary of the service, is that there is a provision in the law that there should be no cultivation on the river riparian, encroachment into the forest area, which are very key for sources of water. So first thing is, a farmer must demonstrate that he has respected the lake, the river riparian, for example. He has respected the forest boundary. Then that qualifies him to receive an incentive in the basin. And of course, when it comes to the market linkages, is we are targeting those farmers in the scheme, because already they are producing too much and they are in the scheme. And we have seen results, because we also monitor some of these initiatives, whether they're having any positive impact on their water resources. For example, we measure turbidity in the rivers. We also check some parameters on maybe E. coli in the water bodies, nitrates and phosphates, so that if we don't find this in a particular river basin, then those farmers qualify for an incentive. So basically, that's how it works.
Thank you, Enock. I hope that answers your question, Tim. We have another one. If you could briefly explain what is the strategy to manage population growth and land encroachment in the riparian zones around the lake?
Basically, we don't really have a law that controls population in Kenya now. But as stakeholders, through the support of the government of Kenya, we are now enforcing the law on preventing people from encroaching into the water bodies. For example, we have a law that is the Kenya Water Act of 2016, which clearly defines the riparian on the lake, where people should not go beyond, and the boundary where people should not go beyond for the rivers. And we are working together with the law enforcers for the government to see people will not encroach any further.
Thank you, Enock. And just to add as well, how was the benefit sharing mechanism set up for the Naivasha PES scheme? How was the benefit sharing mechanism set up for the Naivasha PES scheme, and who manages that?
The mechanism was actually one. There is a contract that we review annually, depending on the changes in the basin, whereby the buyers, that is the beneficiary of the service, and the farmers in the upper catchment comes into an agreement on what they need to do and what the beneficiary of the service want to see. And they enter into a contract to that effect. And then the payment is based on after a verification by the PES steering committee, because we have a PES steering committee that manages and coordinates the PES program in Lake Naivasha Basin. So it is this committee that qualifies on who receive the incentives and who will not, and of course with reasons. So at this point in time we are still giving cash to the farmers, and it's only still a very small amount, because each farmer, for example, this year will receive 5,000 shillings each, and this year we are targeting about 3,100 farmers who are in the PES scheme who will be receiving the incentive for this year.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And which stakeholder in particular took the lead to develop the Naivasha PES, and what was its contribution?
The key stakeholder are basically the Water Resource Users Association. We have a Lake Naivasha Water Resource Users Association in the Lake Naivasha that brings together all the flower farms, all the hotels, and members of this association. So the contribution is made into this association. And then this association now has also a representative in the PES steering committee. The PES steering committee is a composition of all the relevant primary stakeholders in the basin. For example, Imarisha Naivasha has a representative, the Water Resource Authority, the National Environment Authority, and of course the development partners we are working with. So this is now where the money ends, and it's this steering committee that distributes the money to the serving farmers in the upper catchment.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And just looking, I don't think we have any more questions at this time. So thank you very much, Enock. It's a very interesting presentation, and how to coordinate so many different stakeholders with so many different needs and incentive needs across a landscape. So thank you very much. And we will now move on to a presentation from Pauline Nantongo Kalunda, who is the Executive Director of ECOTRUST Uganda, the Environmental Conservation Trust of Uganda. Pauline has more than 12 years experience in carbon finance transactions and is an expert in establishing and managing conservation financial mechanisms. She's successfully established a commercially viable community carbon offsetting scheme through the Trees for Global Benefits, and under her leadership has managed to generate a diverse portfolio on international carbon markets that has ensured consistent access to the market for now 15 years. The Trees for Global Benefit scheme has won in 2013 the Seed Award for its innovation and entrepreneurship and its promising efforts to promote economic growth, social development and environmental protection in Uganda, with the potential of its partnership to inspire others. So with that, I will leave the floor to Pauline to tell us more about how the Trees for Global Benefit is mobilising finance for landscape restoration in Uganda. Pauline, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. If you can go to the next slide, just a little bit maybe about ECOTRUST, the organization that is managing Trees for Global Benefit. We are a Ugandan local NGO, 100% managed by Ugandans, from the board of trustees through the secretariat to the activities on the ground. Our mission combines biological diversity and social welfare, but specifically, the organization was created to occupy that niche of conservation financing. And we mainly do this through partnerships. Next. Next. Okay. Trees for Global Benefits is a scheme. It's a cooperative offsetting scheme where different farmers, small-scale farmers, come in to access the market. We operate in 2 landscapes, in the Albertine Rift and Mount Elgon in Uganda. Even though it's primarily a carbon sequestration scheme or a carbon offsetting scheme, it's basically based on a blended financing model where public funds are blended with private financing. And the scheme just acts as a mechanism that activates multiple cash flows to incentivize the transformation of smallholder investment horizons from the short-term, season-based decision-making approaches to more long-term, between 25 and 50-year investment horizons. And the way we structure the financing or the cash flows is that it's activated at different stages of So just let me take you to Mount Elgon. Mount Elgon is a very important water catchment. It is a catchment for major water bodies such as River Nile, Lake Victoria in Uganda, but also some rivers in Kenya, Turkana, and many others. But it is also faced with a number of threats, mainly habitat degradation or even loss, like wetland loss or forest loss. And it's primarily due to expansion of agriculture as a result of the population growth, where forests and wetlands are cleared, or wetlands are converted into agriculture, but all rechanneled to change the course of some of the streams and rivers, which has resulted into a lot of land degradation and has placed these communities in extreme weather conditions. Almost every year we get landslides in Mount Elgon, characterized by loss of lives, loss of property. So it's a very important site, but also very vulnerable to climate change. And many partners have been working, many stakeholders have been working in this landscape. Local government, central government, and different civil society actors have been working, and they've contributed to a number of incentives. And I will be explaining to you how Trees for Global Benefits has either designed those incentives or capitalized on the other incentives. And the incentives range a wide range. Capital, but in cash, in form of cash, through the payment for environmental services, but also grants, but also capital in form of infrastructure, especially small but necessary infrastructure like for irrigation or gravity water flow schemes or water harvesting arrangements. But then there is also monitoring and enforcement of encroachment. There's also technical assistance, especially to the smallholder farmers, and also access to high value markets, plus a bit of alternative livelihoods. Next slide. So specifically, the way Trees for Global Benefits works is that every smallholder farmer is treated as every farm is treated as an agroforestry enterprise. So the farmer is also an investor that is being incentivized to invest, but also plus other funding sources, the large private sector, public sector. Everybody is being encouraged to invest in the landscape, and each farmer that we work with is supported to make. First, we start by the landscape plan, a landscape-wide plan, which the large stakeholders participated in developing. Then we go community by community, and every community develops either a community vision, which stipulates how they would like to see their community in the next 20 years, 25 years, or 50 years. Or for some, for example, the most vulnerable parts of Mount Elgon, their vision was revolved. So each community develops a plan according to its needs. And then at household level, every household develops a land use plan, which also improving land management through soil and water conservation, but also contributing to climate benefits. And the project currently is covering an area of about 7,000 hectares. And in 2017, we reached the 1 million ton of CO2 certificate that was issued to the project. And every year, from just the sale of carbon credits, we mobilize up to $1 million US and we consider it foreign direct investment in smallholder agroforestry. Next. So the way the private funds work is the carbon scheme is structured in such a way that it will trigger multiple opportunities so that a smallholder farmer can tap into those multiple funding sources. So we start with the climate benefits arising from the plan, from the land use plan, or even arising from the community vision. The community vision is used to develop, is technically specified so that we describe the different activities that can be adopted, and then we quantify the climate benefits in terms of tons of CO2, tons of carbon dioxide that will arise, or how the carbon stocks will increase on farm if you adopt a certain activity within that community vision. So every household develops its business plan or land use plan, indicating which aspects of that community vision they are going to develop. And then we have a database where everything is stored, tracing how much contribution is each individual household making. And then each individual household has targets. There are some uniform targets, but they're in form of percentages. So your targets, it's percentage-wise, but the actual amounts depend on how much land you've put aside for a particular activity. And then these credits that come from all sorts of activities, from all households, from the Mount Elgon landscape, as well as the Albertine landscape, they are all aggregated together and sold on the voluntary carbon market. And then they are sold ex ante. They are sold, the carbon credits are quantified on the basis of the plan, and then they are sold before, as soon as the activities begin, the certificates are issued and they are sold. So the mechanism works as a fund that manages this grant manages this fund, the income from the carbon credits, and we issue out performance-based payments to each individual household according to how each household contributed, according to how much tons of CO2, how many certificates were generated from your piece of land, from your activities. But in addition to that, the farmers are paid through the village savings and loans associations. And we work out an arrangement with those associations whereby the farmers can use their PACE agreements as collateral for loans, and they can use the subsequent payments to offset those loans. Then in addition, we also build the capacity of the farmers to mobilize themselves into marketing groups so that they can access markets for timber and non-timber products that they are producing. Next. So this is how the carbon credits are organized. This is how the carbon credits are commoditized. As you can see, there are very many communities or very many households coming from various communities. Each community or each activity is introduced in, the scheme, the mechanism is developed in form of a program of activities, such that there are very many activities that can be implemented. And each new activity or each new community is introduced into the program through the development of a technical specification. So if there is a new activity that is coming or a new community that is coming to join, we don't have to go through the processes of designing a PIN and a PDD and validation and all those things. So we just design a technical specification, submit it for verification, and that's it. That activity and that community are introduced into the system. So on an annual basis, we submit a report to the Plan Vivo Foundation, which is the certifying body. We submit a report to the Plan Vivo Foundation, and the approval of that report is what triggers the certificates to be issued into the Environmental Market Registry. And then also, alongside the recruitment of farmers and the engagement of farmers, we also engage with private sector, mainly in the US and Europe, sometimes directly, sometimes through brokers. And those private sector inform us on an annual basis how much their contribution to climate change has been in terms of tons of CO2 that they've estimated to have generated. And then they also have accounts in the market registry. So when the credits are released or are issued by the Plan Vivo Foundation into the registry, we also submit certificates to the different accounts of the private sector, of the buyers, so that equivalent to the volumes of CO2 that they told us, so that they can use that to offset their footprint. And every 5 years, we undergo third-party verification. The first 10 years were done by Rainforest Alliance, and the last 5 years have been done, or the first 10 years were by Rainforest Alliance. We made 15 years last year, and the last part was done by Environmental Services Incorporated, based in the US. Next. So in addition to that private funding that comes from the carbon credits, the markets, the circles, credit schemes, we also get public financing. Now, public financing normally comes from the bilateral and multilateral donors, and it's specific to areas such as capacity building and awareness raising, the landscape planning and the community level, the community visions, the parish adaptation plans that I mentioned, any baseline assessments, for example, the vulnerability assessments or biomass assessments or socioeconomic assessments that may be required. But they also contribute to the formation of community structures that will guide or lead the community in participating in the scheme. The documentation for us to be able to put together the PINs, the PDDs, the technical specifications, or if there is a certain strategy that we would like to develop, coming up with a business case for it. Those are the kind of things that public financing contributes to. But specifically, the UNDP gave us money. They gave us some money to capitalize what they call a revolving fund. Now, a revolving fund works in such a way that when you get the donors supporting all these documentation, sometimes it takes a while, or most of the times it takes a while for a community to be validated, or for you to be sure that they will be able to adhere to the requirements of the carbon scheme. But in the meantime, some people are early adopters, and you would like to reward them. So this revolving fund makes those payments before the credits are commoditized. And as soon as the credits are commoditized and sold, it is recouped and reinvested, and it's used to develop another site to also join the scheme. So it supports the scaling up, the growth and the scaling up, and the diversification of the scheme. Next. So this is how, like I mentioned in the beginning, that the different cash flows are triggered at different stages of the agroforestry enterprise. And when we go into an area, usually the initial stages, the capacity building, the awareness raising, the planning, is provided by bilateral and multilateral donors. Normally, it takes us about 3 years to begin accessing the carbon benefits, the carbon credits, or the carbon market for a specific activity, a specific site, or a specific activity that we develop for a technical specification. Then it takes us, I think there's a mistake in that, 2 to 10 years. I think it was supposed to be 5 to 10 years, or 5 to 15 years. It takes us about 2 years of engaging with the community to be able to work out arrangements with the Village Savings and Loans Association, so that from the time they begin getting their payments through those associations to the time when the association is able to give them loans, to allow them to use their PES agreements as collateral for loans. And then from even the last slide has a bit of a mistake. From about year 7 onwards, they are able to now begin selling. Most farmers have multiple management objectives, things like growing trees for fruit, or for fodder, or for medicinal extracts, for building poles, for fuel wood. Some of the products come from the usual silvicultural practices, like the thinning, the pruning, and so on and so forth. But in the end, almost every farmer, the ultimate management objective is timber production. Next. This has been our resource mobilization history. In the beginning, we had more. We started in 2003, but I didn't show the graph, the performance before 2012. But in the beginning, we had more public financing than private financing. But now, currently, our private financing ranges between 60 and 90%, depending on how good a year is, either from the multilateral side or from the private sector side. Next. So those are the different funders, a mixture of both the private and public funding that we've received support, as well as the people that buy the carbon credits. You and We is our biggest broker, supporting us to access about 80% of the sales that we make. That Maxi Burgers, some of you who are based in Europe, if any, you would recognize, is also the largest buyer, the largest carbon offsetter that we have. So basically, it's a cocktail of organizations and institutions and companies that buy the credits, but also that contribute either by way of brokers or funders from public finance or carbon offsetters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pauline. I think that's a very interesting introduction to the work that you've been doing, in particular how a blended finance scheme of public and private financing has activated these multiple cash flows to incentivize smallholders, not just in short-term transitions to more sustainable practices, but also how long-term investment horizons can be used and to activate finance at different stages. We do have a few questions for you, Pauline, regarding your presentation. How will the sustainability of the forest be guaranteed if the carbon markets are not controlled?
Okay, so the forests are on farm. And like I mentioned, the carbon credits are sold ex ante, meaning that if you put in your plan, and it's a 25-year plan or 35-year plan or 50-year plan, all the carbon stocks that you're going to store on your farm are sold up front. So at every 1 year, every farmer that we recruit, the scheme has manned that farmer for the entire rotation period of that particular, of all the farmers that we recruit. So if the carbon market, for example, collapsed, the problem will be that we will not be able to expand. But everybody that has gone into contract, the funds exist to purchase. But also, of course, we don't sell everything that we recruit. Some years we recruit more farmers than we are able to get a market to. But remember, we have the fund. We have the fund. We have the revolving fund that we use to hedge against market failure. But also, every ton of carbon that we sell contributes to a risk fund that does two things. One is if a farmer for some reason is affected. Okay, if farmers are affected by disasters, if farmers are disproportionately affected by, say, drought or fire or whatever it is, it's that fund that helps them to recover. But in some areas, for example, the disaster might be big that the farmer cannot recover. For example, if there is a flood and the entire piece of land, or a landslide and the entire piece of land goes away, that fund is used to recruit another farmer to replace any environmental services that were expected from that farmer. So we have a number of sustainability strategies in place, but the most important one is the ex ante as opposed to ex post crediting of carbon.
Thank you, Pauline. And how are the PES contracts held only by men or also by women in jointly headed husband and wife households?
Okay. So that is a big problem because most of the land is owned by men. So what we do is we take a whole household approach whereby whoever applies becomes a contact person. But when we are engaging, we engage with the spouses, husband and wife, and then plus also some of the older children in the household, because we've had situations where whoever the contact person was passes on, but then this is a long-term contract, and the rest of the members of the households have to take it up. So we engage at the whole house, okay, many people within the household. But then, of course, the person who signs the contract, the contact person is basically the one who receives the money, the one who has the account. So what we do during the community visioning, during the community engagements, we get people to share their testimonies on how working together as husband and wife has worked for them, encouraging basically people to work together. And we have had situations where the man and the wife are both farmers, but of different pieces of land that they own together. As in, they divide, maybe they have 5 hectares, I apply for 2, you apply for another 2, and the other 1 hectare maybe is left for other activities. So we've had, in some places, we have the women as the contact people, and sometimes we have the husbands, and other times both of them are members, but the majority are men. And certain communities, the composition of women is higher than in other communities due to the social-cultural differences.
Thank you, Pauline. And can you also share the breakdown of the credit share with that? How much comes back to a farmer yearly after monitoring and verification costs have been cut out of that?
We have an agreement with the standard, with the Plan Vivo standard, that a minimum of 60% must stay in the community. So yeah, so the share is that 60% to the farmer. Then the 40% is monitoring, capacity building, third-party verification, certificate issuance fees. That is why it's very important to have the public financing, because that 40% is not enough, except if you have public funding that caters for some of the capacity building or removes all these other initial costs, the project development costs. But yes, the breakdown is 60%. And even though the farmer sells the credits for the entire rotation period, so majority of which is 25 years, the payments are delivered in 6 performance-based installments within the first 10 years. Because by year 10, the farmer's livelihood strategy has completely been transformed to be dependent on that land use. So we pay 20% in what we call year 0, year 1, and year 3, and then 10% in year 5 and year 7, and then the final 20% in year 10.
Thank you, Pauline. I hope that clarifies that, Raphaele. And how do you measure the income of every PES scheme? The landowners are the individuals or collective associations?
Even when we have collective, the landowners are individuals, but we have situations where we negotiate for community, for associations to have a co-management arrangement or agreement with, for example, the National Forest Authority to replant some of the degraded areas in the Central Forest Reserve. So what happens is that even in that association, even in that collective association, still every household is allocated a piece that belongs to them. So everybody joins as an individual, even though the capacity building and the awareness raising and the planning and what have you is done collectively. Every household joins as and when they are ready, and they sign an agreement and join as and when they are ready. And the income comes from how much land did you put aside, what activities are you conducting, how much carbon stock are you storing on your land? Because every 1 ton of carbon dioxide receives 1 certificate. So if you have 1 hectare of, say, mixed native agroforestry species, you will maybe generate 238 tons of certificates worth 238 tons of carbon dioxide. Another person has 2 hectares, it will be 460 tons. And then how much the price you receive depends on what the price for that year is, what the buyers are giving us. So we have multiple buyers, as you see this slide, and we have a sliding scale where if you are buying large volumes, you can negotiate for a good price. So we do an average price for that year, and for every ton that you generated, you get 60% of whatever price that we receive.
Thank you, Pauline. And like to ask if there are any more questions for Pauline with her presentation, or for Enock or Raphaele as well. And I see that we're close to the end of time for the webinar. I just have one question for, I suppose, all of the presenters really, with regards to the question of sustainability of financing. I know, Pauline, you touched on that a bit with your presentation, and in Enock with his presentation of the Sustainable Development Fund, but how, in Raphaele's, in your case, how are you integrating the long-term sustainability of financing to ensure that the financing through the webinar will support the protection and restoration of the landscape?
So if I may try to attempt to answer the question quickly, given the restricted time. In our case, it's more a resilience issue, because if the forest is not, or if we don't put any paradigm for the forest protection and restoration right now, the cocoa sourcing altogether might disappear. So it's a question of sustainability in the long run for all actors. So the finance role in this is just to unlock the potential and accelerate the mechanisms that I think all actors have in mind, but never really put in place because of lack of opportunity. So it's just to, unlock the potential and tap into what should be done for the sustainability of the entire sector, and not only of the forest restoration. So it's all linked, really. Not sure that answers your question.
Thank you, Raphaele. It does. And with Enock and Pauline, if you had anything else to add to that. But if not, we have one more question for Enock. With at Lake Naivasha, how are ecotourism activities managed and monitored?
Thank you for that for that question. The ecotourism activities are basically driven by the government. There is a very specific ministry in charge of tourism and wildlife, and ecotourism is one of their mandate. So for one, they are recognized as per the law, and there is some funding that comes from the national treasury to the Ministry of Wildlife, which now gives that money to the establishment of some of these ecotourism activities. And mostly we are targeting the youth, because the population of the youth is quite growing here in Kenya, and specifically in Naivasha. So these youth are supported by the government to establish groups, and these groups are registered as ecotourism. And each group is allocated a space to work on across the basin. So, and again, also with my organization, Imarisha, together with the government of Kenya, we work with them in terms of helping them to manage some of the activities they are doing, and also monitor if they're having any impacts, both to the environment and to their lives.
Thank you, Enock. If there are no more questions, I think Disha has the results of the poll from earlier in the webinar.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry, I'm on mute there. Yes, so we got quite an overwhelming response in some of these sections, where we were trying to figure out how frequently to hold these sessions, and we've got quite a lot of interest for this to be something that's happening on a monthly / ad hoc basis, so much more frequently than quarterly. And everyone seems to be happy with English for now, but there have been a couple of requests for a few different languages, specifically French, Spanish and Chinese. And then also in terms of spaces for discussion for us to continue, we've got a bit of a a combination of the LinkedIn and the D groups seem to be the most popular spaces for us to continue, but there is an other section which a lot of people have ticked, and I'd be keen to find out what these discussion forums are, but unfortunately Zoom doesn't offer us an other and space where people can fill in the much more description, so I'll investigate further on that one. And in terms of demographics for the call, it's quite interesting to see that we've got a lot of people that are joining from Africa, and you can see the other results for the other regions below. And interesting, we've got a big civil society participation today, with almost half of the participants joining that are part of an NGO or a community organisation, and we've got quite a lot of people that are working in this area and are quite knowledgeable about this topic too. We do have another survey that is being shared with everyone, and we'd love to get further details from you. And we'll share this link in the chat feed now. I'd like to thank everyone for participating in that poll. That gives us a lot to think about in terms of our planning for future events.
Thank you, Disha. I'd just like to sum up the presentations first by certainly thanking all of our speakers, Raphaele, Enock and Pauline, for their very interesting presentations, each contributing to the dialogue from different sides of financing from a community-driven perspective, financing from using the value chain as a driving point, and also financing using carbon credits and looking at how the carbon financing market can be utilised to support smallholder farmers. I think the key thing that was drawn across all of the three of these case studies was the need to have a strong governance system at landscape level for all of these models, be that through an intermediary, for example, with the Raphaele's case, or a community-driven association, or an NGO linking to the government in Uganda. And how these, within this system, this governance system, the need for to define clear roles with each stakeholder, so that each stakeholder knows what is expected of them through these schemes, either through financing, for example, linking it to PES and the conditionality there, but also to give them strong ownership of their responsibilities as well. I think what has been interesting about the looking at the value chains and the need to develop strong market access to improve the quality and access, and develops advanced purchasing agreements, as well as enable the traceability of these markets. What I found interesting from Raphaele was that to see how we can use the value chain focus for certain projects, such as cocoa in this example, as a leverage to encourage other sectors to engage. And I think what was clear across all of these presentations was how certain types of financing, the diverse financing that's needed to restore and improve these landscapes, to make them viable landscapes, but also valuable landscapes for local stakeholders, was that certain finances needed at the beginning is different to those needed at the end, and how co-financing through initial grants may trigger funds in the region, for example, that leverage higher public investment, which then later on down the line can trigger private sector investments, such as impact investments across the landscape. As well, the need for this is to incorporate the sustainability of these investments and these project activities was a strong thread throughout all of these case studies, and how different mechanisms have been used to enable that sustainability, including the development of livelihood strategies as key plans to restore the landscape, but also key ways to incentivize smallholders to engage with the restoration process and activities at different stages, but also for them to benefit from restoration and how this can be reflected in their livelihoods. As Disha said, these presentations from all of our speakers and links to discussions and the surveys will be presented online. We're having discussions on both LinkedIn and on the D groups. As part of our survey, we're trying to understand which is going to be the best discussion forum to hold these discussions, so that we can not only just present webinars on them, but share case studies and other knowledge products as per this survey. So once again, I'd like to thank all of our speakers and all of the questions from those participating, and look forward to discussion online. And any questions, please do post them or contact Disha or myself here at FAO.